Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today I'm returning to the topic of star-crossed love stories, focusing on the romantic plights of the Eärendil. I intended this to be my Valentine's gift to the internet, but as you can see it did not come out on Valentine's Day, because my time management skills are Previously, I've made videos about Middle-earth's most famous romances between members of different peoples. Thingol and Melian, Andreth and Aignor, Beren and Luthien, Tuor and Eärendil, and Aragorn and Arwen. These will be linked below and at the end of the video if you want to check them out. One of the major lasting achievements of these trailblazing couples was the establishment of families on both sides of the mortality divide, with mingled Mannish and Elven ancestry. Naturally, for this to be successful in the long run, the oddball children of these power couples would have to find mates of their own. And it's that critical intermediate step that is the subject of this video. I am able to cover 5 of these half-elven love stories in one video because very little is known about most of these relationships. Yet they were vital in shaping Middle-earth's history. And while the participants wouldn't have been as radically different from each other as in the more famous examples, it still strikes me as a tricky proposal, pun intended, to find a mate and start a family among elves or men when you yourself are not really human or elven, but rather some bizarre third thing. Dior Eärendil, the first of the Eärendil, is the only child of Beren and Luthien, born after they return from the Halls of Mondos and settle in Eärendil. As far as we know, Dior lives here for most of his tragically short life. He and his wife, the elf woman Nimloth, live beside the waterfall called Llanthir Lammath, where their children are born. Dior is still a young man when conflict breaks out between Doriath and the dwarves of Nogrod, during which Thingol is killed, Menegroth is raided, and Melian vanishes. Dior and his father lead an army of green elves to destroy the dwarven host and reclaim the Nauglamir, which is set with the Silmaril. But Doriath is now left without a king, or the magical protection of Melian's girdle. So while Beren and Luthien remain in Eärendil, Dior relocates his family to Menegroth to take up the rule of Doriath. Scarcely has he gotten his throne warmed back up when a messenger brings him the Silmaril, which he takes as tacit news of his parents' second death. With the Silmaril burning at his throat, Dior makes it his mission to renew his grandfather's flagging kingdom. But he hits a major snag since, along with the jewel, he's also inherited a blood feud with Middle-earth's most murderlicious family. Dior ignores their messages, which is not a strategy you want to employ if your goal is to die peacefully of old age. And in the ensuing Feanorian sack of Menegroth, Dior and Nimloth are slain, their sons lost in the wilds, and their young daughter barely escapes down the River Sirion. More on her later. There is a lot I find strange about this couple. First, there's the enigma of Dior himself, a character whose existence is of central importance, but about whose personality we know almost nothing, and whose life is so abbreviated, in any case, that he's more a victim of the narrative than a driver of it. Dior is presumed to be mortal by default, since it was only later that the Valar would offer Eärendil, Elwing, and their sons the choice of which kindred to belong to. He certainly seems to age at a normal mannish rate. The exact dates can get a little weird because, well, this is Tolkien we're talking about, but our best combined guess has Dior dying around age 35, already in possession of a wife, 3 children, and a kingdom. So, for all intents and purposes, a fully grown adult. However, that's one of the few normal things about Dior, who was born to parents who were both, in some sense, undead. And not only is he half-human, but also a quarter Maya, a combination that must have been pretty trippy. Even less is known of Dior's wife, who is named Nimloth in the Silmarillion, but bears other names in writings from different eras. The Silmarillion calls her a kinswoman of Celeborn, and this is borne out by one possible version of Celeborn's family tree, in which they are both descendants of Thingol's semi-canonical younger brother, Elmo. However, even this scrap of information is uncertain. Why such an otherwise unremarkable woman, seemingly of solid gray elven stock, would decide to yoke herself to the unholy freak show that is Dior is beyond my ability to fathom. Did Dior's elven bride know that he was likely going to die relatively soon? Did she accept this easily, or was she troubled by it? What about their children, who would presumably have been mortal like their father, despite their mostly inhuman genes? The political implications of Dior's marriage also raise questions. Dior and Nimloth's life is defined by the realm of Doriath, but it seems that they spent most of their marriage living outside it. Dior's name was derived from the Sindarin word for successor, but with his grandfather Thingol being an elf, the couple probably wasn't planning on ever assuming his throne. This could explain how naively optimistic some of their life choices seem. Perhaps they originally believed they would be able to live a quiet life among the Green Elves, with Nimloth prepared to move on once her husband, and perhaps her children, departed the world in the way of men. If this had come about, they could have been a living counter-argument to Aegnor's refusal of Andreth, but as it is, their tragic deaths only serve to emphasize his point. Elwing, the daughter of the previous pair, was a very young child at the time of the second kinslaying. Following the death of her family, sack of her city, and destruction of her kingdom, she and a group of refugees escaped to the hidden strongholds at the mouths of the River Sirion. A few years later, Gondolin falls, sending another wave of elves fleeing to the havens. Among them are Eärendil, Tuur, and their son Eärendil. Eärendil and Elwing grow up together, fall in love, and eventually marry. Shortly after the birth of their sons, however, Eärendil decides to undertake a perilous voyage west, in a probably doomed effort to secure the Valar's help against Morgoth. While he is away, those darn Feanorians reappear, looking, as always, for their Silmaril. Elwing declines to surrender it, unlocking yet another kinslaying level and getting the Wholesale Destruction of Your Home achievement. Cornered by irate Noldor, Elwing throws herself into the sea, Silmaril and all. Or at least she tries to, but Ulmo gives her a lift, and through some weird combination of fate, divine intervention, and cryptic Maiaran powers, she turns into a great white bird. Flying westward, she meets Eärendil's ship, which had failed to make it past Valinor's protective enchantments. Fueled by a new surge of desperation, and with a Silmaril to use as collateral, Eärendil and Elwing try again, and this time the ship makes it to the shores of Valinor. Elwing refuses to remain on board and disembarks with her husband, both of them risking the wrath of the Valar by doing so. Eärendil heads to Tirion, where eventually someone spots him and gets him an audience with Manwë. Elwing, in the meantime, wanders to Alqualondë, where the Teleri who encounter her welcome her as long-lost family. With Eärendil's plea accepted, the couple are given special dispensation from the Valar to choose which kindred they want to be counted among. And Elwing chose to be judged among the firstborn children of Ilúvatar, because of Luthien, and for her sake, Eärendil chose alike, though his heart was rather with the kindred of men and the people of his father. Never again to set foot on Middle-earth, he bears the Silmaril through the heavens as a star of hope, while Elwing builds a tall tower so that she can watch for his return, and sometimes even fly out to meet him. Eärendil and Elwing were central figures in the legendarium almost from its very conception, so we know more about them than we do about some of these other couples. Their story holds many parallels to that of Beren and Luthien, including a doomed Silmaril-powered death quest, a shape-shifting lady catching up to her stymied beau just when he's ready to give up, an entreaty on behalf of men and elves before the Valar, and one half of the couple forsaking their preferred destiny for the sake of the other. However, Eärendil and Elwing don't often attract the same appreciation as the more famous couples do. Maybe some of this is because of Eärendil's significance, with his name and legend being so celebrated in later ages that he seems like more of a symbol than a person. It could also be because both are sometimes perceived as abandoning their people, although one of the core themes of their legend is that in order to give Middle-earth a chance of salvation, they themselves must leave it behind, a dilemma also faced by Frodo, among others. Even without the drama of transmogrification and cursed jewels, Eärendil and Elwing have a really beautiful story. Two kids growing up in what was more or less a refugee camp, the only ones of their kind, child heirs to the thrones of lost kingdoms, caught up in dooms and prophecies and destinies too big for them to understand, braving death and worse time and time again for the sake of their home and each other. Next on our chronological list is the couple we know least about, the marriage between Elros and his wife, who definitely existed, and that's about all that can be said of her. Elros and Elrond, the sons of Elwing and Eärendil, ended up in the Feanorians' custody for a while before being foisted off onto Gil-galad sometime during the War of Wrath. When the war ended, Elros and Elrond are given the choice of the Eärendil, and Elros decides to be counted among men. Since he is one of 2 remaining heirs to most of the ruling or noble families of the First Age, both human and elven, he becomes the leader of the Edain on their voyage west to the island that will become Númenor. Once there, he becomes the first king of the Dúnedain, Elros Tar Miniatur. At some point, presumably he married, because upon his death at the ripe age of 500, he leaves behind 4 legitimate children. To say anything meaningful about Elros and his wife, we have to rely on inference. But that still gives us something to go on. The first 50 or so years of Elros' life were indisputably gnarly, and his wife was likely among the surviving Edain of Beleriand, which means her life was probably no bed of roses either. Despite this, or maybe because of it, both took the massive risk of sailing to the middle of the ocean and settling a land that had just been created from scratch by the very Valar who had been involved in the sinking of their last continent. Even at a relatively young age, Elros seems to have concluded that it would be better if his life eventually came to an end and allowed him to escape Middle-earth forever, even if this came along with aging, infirmity, and losing his loved ones. This could be a sign of his terrible childhood, or of his stubborn hope in the possibility of something better, or a little of both. Elros' unknown wife, then, chose to marry a man who was more than half inhuman, who could have chosen to live forever, but instead took on the dreadful gift of mortality of his own free will. She also bore him 4 children, and while that's not enough to threaten Eärendil's undisputed status as Middle-earth's most put-upon mother, 4 kids is still enough that, if she lived in 21st century suburbia, she would be forced to buy a vehicle with third-row seating. If the story of Elrond and Celebrían were posted on a fanfiction website, it would be tagged as tooth-rotting fluff turned hurt no comfort. The other son of Elwing and Eärendil, Elrond chooses to be counted among the Eldar, but he also chooses to remain on Middle-earth rather than heading west. He works for Gil-galad throughout the Second Age, experiencing his brother's death, the disastrous reappearance of Sauron, the rise and fall of Eregion and loss of Celebrimbor, and the slow corruption and destruction of Númenor. In 1697, he establishes a defensible base of operations at Imladris, which he will ultimately convert into a medi-spa/writing retreat. Throughout the first 3,000 or so years of his life, he remains resolutely single, but shortly after founding Imladris, and well past the youthful age at which most elves are expected to marry, he meets and falls for Celebrían, the daughter of Galadriel and Celeborn. Little is known about Celebrían's personality, but as the child of Galadriel and Celeborn, whose marriage is notoriously unorthodox, she, like Elrond, represents the union of 2 very different worlds. Compared to most of the rest of his family, Elrond shows a laudable reluctance to let his feelings compel him into rash action, and so he says nothing to Celebrían at the time. It's only once the War of the Last Alliance ends and Sauron is out of the way for the foreseeable future that he and Celebrían wed early in the Third Age, with their sons and daughter born shortly after. Sadly, it is one of the immutable laws of Arda that Elrond cannot have nice things. And in 2509 of the Third Age, while making a trip to Lothlorien, Celebrían is captured by orcs. Now, Elrond may be a little more circumspect than some others I could name, but he and his kids are true scions of all their many notable forebears, none of whom would let a little thing like unprecedented numbers of mountain goblins directed by what turns out to be an actual Balrog keep them from their loved ones. Sure enough, Celebrían is promptly rescued by her sons, but the effects of her captivity are not so quickly resolved. She was brought back to Imladris and, though healed in body by Elrond, lost all delight in Middle-earth and the next year went to the Havens and passed oversea. It's easy to read this story as just another stage of Elrond's personal conga line of traumas, And for sure, it is that, but that's not all it is. It's an example of a story where love alone cannot prevail, and characters have to carry on despite that bitter fact. It would be so easy for Elrond to cling to his beloved wife and insist that eventually he will be able to heal her in body and mind. Instead, he accepts that even he lacks the power to cure some ailments, trusts his wife's decision, and lets her go, despite the pain it causes. Celebrían, for her part, could have simply faded away in despair, or else lingered on in Middle-earth, a broken woman deluding herself about the severity of her condition. By sailing west, she shows both acceptance of reality and the hope of finding true healing. She endures the separation from her family for a chance at a truly joyful reunion. Now, this one represents a break in the pattern of half-elven marriages. Although technically Imrazôr, being of Númenórean descent, probably has some elf in him if you go back far enough. But it's not so much the marriage itself as its implications that makes it relevant to this conversation. First, the facts, of which there are few, mostly detailed in Tolkien's unpublished notes. According to a legend handed down by the people of southern Gondor, the men of Dol Amroth had long ago mingled with various populations of Sylvan elves. Specifically, the ancestors of the princes of Dol Amroth, such as Imrahil, are rumored to include an elf woman named Mithrellas. Mithrellas was one of the elves who accompanied Nimrodel on her journey from Lorien south to Eärendil midway through the Third Age. The party is scattered while crossing the White Mountains, and their ultimate fates are largely unknown, but at least one of them apparently ran into Imrazôr, a man of Belfalas. In this tale it is said that Imrazôr harbored Mithrellas and took her to wife, but when she had borne him a son, Galador, and a daughter, Gilmith, she slipped away by night, and he saw her no more. This raises so many questions. First of all, this story is less a matter of historical fact and instead more of a folk tradition. And what's more, one that is quite conveniently flattering to Dol Amroth's ruling family. It's been circulating among the men of the South for over a millennium, and Tolkien himself often called the accuracy of such sources into question. However, Legolas seems to think the story plausible. When he and Gimli meet Imrahil in Minas Tirith, Legolas looked at him and bowed low, for he saw that here indeed was one who had elven blood in his veins. "Hail, Lord," he said, "it is long since the people of Nimrodel left the woodlands of Lorien, and yet still one may see that not all sailed from Amroth's haven west over water." Now, no one should trust the spectacular Sindo-Sylvan space cadet to accurately recall historical details, least of all when it comes to Nimrodel, but his word still has to count for something here. Secondly, while stumbling across one's beautiful future wife in the wilderness is in the grand tradition of Tolkienian love stories, it is also a motif that shows up in stories like that of Eärendil and Eärendil, the latter of whom was famously said to have been not wholly unwilling when she married Eärendil. Did Imrazôr rescue Mithrellas, or was it more of an acquisition? For her part, did she remain with him and eventually bear his children out of sincere, passionate love, or was something else motivating her? Where did she vanish to, and why? And why stay long enough to bear him 2 children and then leave? Finally, assuming this story is accurate, why is it that every other example of elves and men even considering intermarriage is treated as a matter of great significance, usually associated with the involvement of at least one kind of doom, but Imrazôr and Mithrellas are relegated to a couple of late footnotes and a passing comment from Thranduil's celebrated idiot son? Elsewhere, we are told that marriages between man and elf accomplish high purposes of doom, so what great cosmic circumstances necessitated the brief marriage of a Sylvan elf woman and a Dunedain noble halfway through the Third Age? Or could it be that this is actually not as big a deal as the histories might lead us to believe? The appendices to The Lord of the Rings specify there were 3 unions of the Eldar and the Edain, Luthien and Beren, Idril and Tuur, Arwen and Aragorn. By the last, the long-sundered branches of the half-elven were reunited and their line was restored. The histories compiled by the descendants of these couples naturally focus on the Edain and the Eldar, but have much less to say about the other clans and cultures that do exist among both elves and men. Long before Finrod Felagund first came across the people of Beor in Thargelion, the ancestors of the Edain had already encountered groups of Avari and Nandor in the east, and we simply don't know how common or uncommon intermarriage was in these circumstances. Now, it probably remained a rare event, but rare doesn't necessarily mean unheard of, as the legend of Mithrellas and Imrazôr, and the credulity of its reception, shows. How many unrecorded elven spouses vanished into the night when the heartbreak of loving a family they were doomed to lose became too much? How many mortals passed from youth to old age under the fathomless gaze of their unchanging paramours? How many meetings between elf and man left both parties startled by the recognition of an undeniable, unnerving degree of kinship far closer than what the official histories claimed possible? The diverse courses of Middle-earth's lesser-known unconventional relationships offer a look at lives touched by high romance but not defined by them. And that's the kind of #couple goals we can all get behind. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button as hard as thoughts of cold, implacable mortality hit after midnight. Plight your troth to future videos by hitting subscribe and turning on notifications. Thank you to everyone for watching, and extra thanks to my patrons, including but not limited to Sam Calder, Seven-Eyed, Rico Mariani, Perhyle the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B., James A. McCormick, Gandalf the Grey, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, Joel Bion, and Jared Carver. Check out the link in the description to learn more.